Once upon a time, there lived a man named Kane Sterling who had everything money could buy. By 30, he had built a tech empire worth billions of dollars. His face appeared on magazine covers. People called him the golden boy of business. But 10 years ago, something terrible happened that changed everything. His beautiful wife died suddenly, leaving him alone with their baby daughter, Lila. The world still saw a powerful businessman, but behind closed doors, Kane spent every night reading bedtime stories and trying to fill the empty space where his wife used to be. Now Lila was 12 years old, and she had grown into a wise little girl who noticed everything. She saw how her father worked late into the night, how he avoided making friends, and how lonely he looked when he thought no one was watching. The mansion felt too big and too quiet. Kane had money, success, and fame, but he didn't have love. He had built walls around his heart so high that no one could climb them. But sometimes, late at night, he wondered what it would feel like to love someone again. One peaceful evening, as autumn leaves danced outside their window, Lila curled up next to her father on their giant couch. She looked up at him with her mother's gentle eyes and said something that would change both their lives forever. "Dad," she whispered softly, "maybe it's time you tried love again." Her words hit Kane like lightning. This 12-year-old girl, who should have been thinking about homework and friends, was worried about her father's lonely heart. He realized that in trying to protect himself from more pain, he had forgotten how to truly live. That night, after Lila went to bed, Kane sat in his study and made a decision. He would open his heart again. But this time, he wouldn't look for someone who wanted his money or fame. He would search for someone who could love him for who he really was inside. He wanted someone who would sit with them at breakfast, someone who would laugh at Lila's jokes, someone who would see the man behind all the success and wealth. Someone real. But finding real love would be harder than building his empire. For the next 18 months, Kane tried everything he could think of. He went to fancy parties where diamonds sparkled under crystal chandeliers. He met women who smiled perfectly and said all the right words. They were beautiful, educated, and sophisticated. But every single one of them had the same look in their eyes. They saw dollar signs. They saw magazine covers. They saw a ticket to a life of luxury and fame. When they looked at Kane, they didn't see a father who worried about his daughter. They didn't see a man who still missed his wife. They didn't see someone who just wanted to be loved. Some of these women barely spoke to Lila at all. Others tried too hard to impress her, bringing expensive gifts but never asking what she actually liked. A few even suggested that Lila should go to boarding school so she wouldn't be in the way. Each failed relationship left Kane feeling more empty inside. After every goodbye, he felt more convinced that no one would ever love the real him. Maybe he was destined to be alone forever, surrounded by people who only cared about his bank account. Late one night, Kane sat in his kitchen eating instant noodles straight from the pot. Lila found him there, looking sadder than she had ever seen him. She sat down beside him and waited quietly, the way her mother used to do. "I have an idea," Kane said suddenly, his eyes lighting up with something Lila hadn't seen in years. "What if we disappeared?" Lila tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean, Dad? What if we left all of this behind for 6 months? We could go to a small town where nobody knows who we are. I could get a job as a teacher, and we could live like normal people. If someone could love me without knowing I'm Kane Sterling the billionaire, then maybe it would be real." Lila's face broke into the biggest smile. "Like a secret adventure?" "Exactly like a secret adventure. Just you and me, finding out what it's like to be ordinary people." For the first time in months, they both felt hope. This crazy plan might actually work. Before the sun rose the next morning, their loyal butler James drove them to a private airport. James had worked for the Sterling family for 20 years, and he understood without being told that this journey was important. "Take care of everything while we're gone," Kane told him, handing over control of his companies, his mansions, and his entire empire. "Don't tell anyone where we've gone. This has to remain a secret." James nodded solemnly. "I'll protect your secret, sir." And I'll make sure everything is waiting for you when you return. On the plane, Kane looked at himself in the small window. Instead of his usual expensive suit, he wore a thrifted sweater with a small hole in the elbow and worn sneakers that had seen better days. His hair was messy, and he hadn't shaved. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. For the first time in years, he didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like an ordinary father taking his daughter on a trip. Lila pressed her face to the window, watching clouds drift by below them. "I'm excited, Dad. This is going to be the best adventure ever." Their plane landed in a small coastal town where seagulls cried over fishing boats and children rode bicycles down quiet streets. The air smelled like salt and pine trees, nothing like the city they had left behind. They rented a tiny cottage with creaky pine floors and a stubborn front door that stuck when it rained. There were only 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen so small that 2 people could barely fit inside it at the same time. Lila loved it immediately. She hung fairy lights in her room and declared it was much cozier than her enormous bedroom at home. "It feels like a dollhouse, Dad, but one we can actually live in." Kane spent hours creating a fake resume and bank account for his new identity. He would be Mr. K, a modest literature teacher with a simple background. No private schools, no fancy degrees, no connections to wealth or power. He practiced introducing himself in the mirror until it felt natural. "Hi, I'm Mr. K. I teach literature." The words felt strange in his mouth, but also somehow freeing. For the first time in his adult life, he was nobody special. On his first day at the local school, Kane's hands shook as he walked into the crowded staff room. Teachers rushed around him, carrying coffee cups and stacks of papers. Most barely glanced in his direction. The principal introduced him quickly before hurrying away to handle some crisis. Kane stood awkwardly by the copy machine, feeling more nervous than he had during billion-dollar business meetings. Then he saw her. A woman sat by the window, quietly organizing art supplies. She had paint under her fingernails and wore a simple dress covered in tiny flowers. Her hair caught the morning sunlight, and when she looked up and smiled at him, something stirred in his chest. "You must be the new literature teacher," she said, walking over with an easy grace. "I'm Amara. I teach art." Her voice was gentle and warm, like honey in tea. When she shook his hand, she didn't try to impress him or ask about his background. She simply welcomed him with genuine kindness. "I'm Mr. K," he managed to say, hoping his voice sounded normal. For reasons he couldn't explain, he already knew this woman was special. Kane's first day of teaching was a complete disaster. He dropped his books twice, forgot half his students' names, and couldn't figure out how to work the projector. The whiteboard marker ran out of ink, and when he tried to replace it, he accidentally knocked over a plant. His students giggled, but not in a mean way. They seemed to think their clumsy new teacher was endearing rather than incompetent. After his last class, Kane slumped at his desk, feeling embarrassed and defeated. He had run companies with thousands of employees, but he couldn't even teach a simple literature lesson without making a fool of himself. That's when he found the sticky note on his desk. "You're doing fine. It gets easier. Amara." The handwriting was neat and encouraging. Such a simple message, but it meant everything to him. Kane carefully peeled off the note and tucked it into his wallet like it was made of gold. Nobody had encouraged him like this in years. In his business world, people either feared him or wanted something from him. But Amara had seen him struggle and chosen to be kind without expecting anything in return. Maybe this teaching thing might work out after all. As days turned into weeks, Kane and Lila settled into their new life like puzzle pieces finding their perfect spots. Every morning, Kane walked Lila to her school, something he had never been able to do in their old life because of early business meetings and travel. They shopped for groceries at the small market, where the cashier knew everyone's name and asked about their families. Lila made friends quickly, and soon their cottage was full of children's laughter for the first time ever. In the evenings, they cooked simple dinners together and talked about their days. Lila told him about her art class and her new friends. Kane shared funny stories about his students, carefully leaving out how much he was learning about teaching. On weekends, they fixed up their cottage. They painted the walls, planted flowers in the small garden, and repaired the loose floorboard that creaked whenever anyone walked on it. Slowly, something amazing happened. The armor of wealth and power that Cain had worn for so many years began to crack and fall away. Underneath, he discovered a man he had almost forgotten existed, a father, a neighbor, just a regular person who could be happy with simple pleasures. But living a double life was harder than Cain had expected. One afternoon at the local cafe, he automatically started to sign his receipt with his real name, Cain Sterling. His heart nearly stopped as he realized what he was doing. Quickly, he scratched out the letters and wrote K instead, but his hands were shaking. The waitress didn't notice anything, but panic shot through Cain like electricity. One small slip like that could destroy everything. If anyone discovered who he really was, word would spread faster than wildfire in a small town. Reporters would come. Photographers would follow Lila to school. Their peaceful life would be shattered. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the old cottage creak around them. Being Mr. K was supposed to feel natural by now, but sometimes he caught himself thinking like a billionaire, expecting service he couldn't afford or solutions that money could buy. It was exhausting to constantly watch every word, every gesture, every instinct that might give him away. But when he heard Lila laughing with her friends in the garden, he knew it was worth every anxious moment. As autumn deepened into winter, Cain found himself watching Amara more carefully. In his old life, women had tried to impress him with designer clothes and perfect manners. But Amara was different in every possible way. She arrived at school early to set up art supplies for students who couldn't afford their own. During lunch, she stayed with kids who had nowhere else to go, teaching them to draw or just listening to their problems. When it rained, she drove students home who might otherwise walk in the storm. She never talked about herself or tried to get attention. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in everyone around her. She asked the janitor about his sick wife and remembered which students were struggling with problems at home. Unlike the wealthy women he had dated, Amara seemed to care only about giving to others, never about what she might receive in return. When she painted murals with her students, her face lit up with pure joy. She would get paint in her hair and on her clothes, but she didn't care. She was completely absorbed in creating something beautiful with children who looked at her like she was magic. Watching her, Cain began to understand what he had been searching for all along. Gradually, Amara started spending her lunch breaks chatting with Cain. They would sit in the small teacher's lounge, sharing simple sandwiches and talking about books, their students, and life in the coastal town. "Where did you teach before coming here?" she asked one day, genuinely curious about his background. Cain's stomach fluttered with panic, but he had prepared for this question. "Oh, different places," he said vaguely. "I moved around quite a bit." She nodded, not pushing for details the way some people might. It must have been hard, never staying in one place long enough to feel at home. "Yes," he said, and realized he was telling the truth. His old life had felt like constantly moving, even when he stayed in the same mansion for months. "But I think I'm starting to feel at home here." Amara smiled, and something warm spread through his chest. When she listened to him talk, she paid attention like his words really mattered. She didn't check her phone or look around the room for more interesting people to talk to. For the first time in years, Cain felt truly heard by someone who wasn't paid to listen to him. Winter brought a gentle rhythm to the small town that Cain had never experienced in his busy city life. On Saturday mornings, families gathered at the farmer's market to buy fresh bread and vegetables. Children rode their bikes down quiet streets while parents called to each other from front porches. Cain learned the names of his neighbors and the stories of families who had lived in the same houses for generations. He discovered which cafe made the best coffee and which bakery sold cookies that Lila loved. One Saturday morning at the flower stall, he saw Amara choosing daisies for her classroom. When she spotted him, she waved with genuine happiness, as if seeing him had made her whole day brighter. Walking home with groceries in his arms instead of having them delivered by servants, Kane found himself smiling for no particular reason except that the sun was shining and Amara had been glad to see him. This quiet, ordinary life was beginning to feel more real than anything he had experienced in his billionaire world. Maybe this was what happiness actually felt like, not the rush of closing a big deal or seeing your name in the newspaper, but simply belonging somewhere with people who cared about you. When the science classroom's heater broke during a particularly cold week, Kane couldn't stand watching students shiver through their lessons. Without thinking, he called a repair company and paid for a brand new heater to be installed immediately. To avoid suspicion, he told the repair company to say an anonymous donor had covered the costs. The students cheered when they walked into their warm classroom the next day, and teachers spent the week trying to figure out who their mysterious benefactor might be. Amara watched Kane carefully during these discussions, noticing how he smiled quietly but never said anything. There was something about the new literature teacher that didn't quite add up, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "That was really generous of whoever did it," she said to him one afternoon. "Yes," Kane agreed, trying to keep his voice casual. "Very generous." But Amara's artist eyes were trained to notice details others missed. She had seen how Kane's clothes, though simple, were made of surprisingly good quality fabric. She had noticed that he never worried about money the way other teachers did, and that he seemed uncomfortable whenever people discussed financial struggles. Still, she kept her observations to herself, sensing that pushing for answers might drive him away. The first big storm of winter hit on a Thursday afternoon, sending teachers and students scrambling for cover as rain poured down in sheets. Kane had forgotten his umbrella, and he was getting soaked walking to his car when Amara appeared beside him. "Share?" she asked, holding up her small blue umbrella. They hurried across the parking lot together, pressed close under the tiny umbrella that couldn't possibly keep both of them dry. Rain dripped down their faces, and their shoes splashed through puddles, but they couldn't stop laughing. "This isn't working very well," Amara gasped as water soaked through her jacket. "Not even a little bit," Kane agreed, but he was smiling wider than he had in years. When they reached her car, they stood there for a moment, both dripping wet and grinning like children who had just discovered the fun of playing in rain. Amara's hair stuck to her face, and Kane's sweater was completely soaked, but neither of them seemed to care. That night, as he tucked Lila into bed, Kane found himself thinking about Amara's laugh and the way she had shared her umbrella without hesitation, even though it meant getting drenched herself. Such a small act of kindness, but it filled his heart with warmth. The following week, Amara surprised Kane by inviting him and Lila to dinner at her house. "Nothing fancy," she promised. "Just homemade pasta and good company." Her home was everything their mansion wasn't: small, cozy, and filled with evidence of real life. Art supplies covered the kitchen table, books were stacked on every surface, and photographs of friends and family smiled from the walls. Amara's teenage brother lived with her, and within minutes he and Lila were chatting like old friends, comparing notes about their schools and laughing at inside jokes only siblings would understand. Watching his daughter's face glow with happiness across the dinner table, Kane felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The sense of belonging to a family that wasn't bound by duty or obligation, but by genuine affection and shared joy. The pasta was slightly overcooked, the salad was simple, and they ate off mismatched plates, but it was the most perfect meal Kane could remember. Nobody discussed business deals or investment strategies. Instead, they talked about books, shared funny stories, and listened to each other with real interest. For a few hours, Kane forgot completely about being a billionaire in disguise and simply enjoyed being a man having dinner with people he was growing to love. After dinner, while Lila and Amara's brother played board games inside, Kane and Amara sat on her front porch watching stars appear in the clear winter sky. The quiet between them felt comfortable, like a conversation without words. Kane wanted desperately to tell her the truth about who he was. The secret felt heavy in his chest, especially when she trusted him enough to share stories about her childhood and her dreams for her students. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life," he said carefully, testing the waters. Amara looked at him with those artist eyes that seemed to see more than most people. "We all wear masks sometimes," she said softly. "The question is whether we wear them to hide from people or to protect them." Her words hit him like an arrow to the heart. She understood something about hiding that most people never would, and for a moment he thought she might already know his secret. Just then, Lila called from inside, breaking the spell. "Dad, can we go? I have school tomorrow." The moment passed, and Kane's confession remained locked inside his chest, where fear kept it prisoner. Reality intruded on their peaceful life in unexpected ways. James called every few days with updates about stock prices, board meetings, and legal issues that required Kane's attention. Hearing about billion-dollar acquisitions while sitting in his tiny cottage kitchen, holding a chipped mug that one of his students had made in art class, felt like living in two different worlds at once. "The Tokyo deal needs your signature," James would say, and Kane would have to remember that he was still one of the most powerful businessmen in the world, even though he spent his days teaching teenagers about poetry and metaphors. Sometimes he would hang up the phone and look around the cottage, wondering which life was real. Was he really Kane Sterling, the billionaire who owned companies around the globe? Or was he Mr. K, the literature teacher who worried about lesson plans and graded papers late into the night? The longer he stayed in the small town, the more Mr. K felt like his true identity and Kane Sterling felt like a costume he used to wear. But he knew this peaceful time couldn't last forever. Eventually, he would have to choose between the life he had built and the life he was learning to love. By spring, the whole town was buzzing with gossip about the new literature teacher and the art teacher. People had noticed how Kane and Amara smiled at each other in the hallways, how they ate lunch together every day, and how happy they both seemed. "They make a lovely couple," the librarian told anyone who would listen. "Both of them so devoted to their students, and that little girl of his is just precious." Kane felt panic rise in his throat every time he heard the whispers. Small towns love to talk, and the more people paid attention to him, the greater the risk that someone might start asking questions about his background or looking too closely at his story. But Amara just rolled her eyes when people made comments about their romance. "Let them talk," she said with a laugh. "People in small towns need something to keep them entertained." Her casual attitude about the gossip made Kane's chest ache with tenderness and guilt. She trusted him completely, never suspecting that he was lying about everything from his name to his past to his reasons for being there. He hated deceiving someone so genuine, but he was too afraid of losing her to tell the truth. Kane's worst nightmare came true on a sunny Tuesday morning when he spotted a man with a camera lurking outside the school. His blood ran cold as he recognized the type, a tabloid photographer, the kind who made millions tracking down celebrities and exposing their secrets. That afternoon, he overheard two teachers talking about a journalist who had been asking questions around town. "Looking for some missing billionaire," one of them said. "Can you imagine? As if someone like that would ever come to a place like this." Kane barely made it to the bathroom before his panic attack hit. His hands shook, his heart raced, and he couldn't catch his breath. After 18 months of peace, the wolves had found his trail. He managed to avoid being photographed by leaving through the back door and taking side streets home, but he knew it was only a matter of time. If that journalist stayed in town much longer, someone would eventually point him toward the mysterious new teacher who had appeared with no real background story. That night, fear made him do something he immediately regretted. He started pulling away from Amara, hoping that distance might protect her from the storm that was coming. Amara noticed the change immediately. Suddenly, Kane was avoiding her in the hallways, eating lunch alone, and giving short answers when she tried to talk to him. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by worry and something that looked almost like guilt. Finally, she confronted him after school one day, cornering him in his empty classroom. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Did I do something to upset you?" Kane's heart broke at the hurt in her voice. "It's not you," he said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "It's me. I'm not who you think I am." "What do you mean?" He wanted to tell her everything, his real name, his fortune, his reasons for coming to their town, and how much he had come to love her. But terror strangled the words in his throat. I can't do this," he said finally, hating himself for the pain that flashed across her face. Amara stood there for a moment, studying him with those artist eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the door. "When you're ready to trust me with the truth," she said quietly, "you know where to find me." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like his heart breaking. That night, Lila found her father sitting on their tiny porch, staring at nothing. She had watched him become happier over the past months, and now she could see him retreating back into the loneliness that had surrounded him for years. "You're making a mistake, Dad," she said, settling down beside him with the confidence of a 12-year-old who had figured out something important about life. "What do you mean?" "Miss Amara. You're pushing her away because you're scared, but that's not fair to either of you." Kane looked at his daughter, amazed as always by her wisdom. "It's complicated, Lila. There are things about our situation that she doesn't understand. But if she doesn't know the real you, then she can't love you for real either," Lila pointed out with devastating logic. "And if you don't tell her the truth, you'll never know if what you have is actually love or just pretending." Her words hit him like lightning. His daughter had just explained the exact problem he had been trying to solve by coming to this town in the first place. He had wanted to find someone who could love the real him, but how could Amara do that if she didn't know who he really was? That night, Kane made the scariest decision of his life. He would risk everything and tell her the truth. The next evening, Kane called Amara and asked her to meet him at the school. His voice shook as he made the request, and she must have heard something in his tone because she agreed without asking questions. They met in his empty classroom, where fairy lights from a recent student project cast gentle shadows on the walls. Kane had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but now that the moment had arrived, he could barely remember how to speak. "My real name is Kane Sterling," he began, and watched her eyes widen with shock. "I'm the billionaire who disappeared from the news 18 months ago. I came here with my daughter because I wanted to find someone who could love me without knowing about my money or my fame." He told her everything, about his wife's death, about the women who had only wanted his fortune, about his desperate desire to find authentic love, and about how terrified he was of losing the life they had built together. When he finished, Amara sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was cold with anger and betrayal. "You lied to everyone. You lied to me. How can I trust anything you've said or done?" Before he could answer, she walked out, leaving him alone with his confession and his breaking heart. For 3 days, Kane waited for Amara to call or come by, but she remained completely silent. Finally, he sat down and wrote her a letter, pouring out everything he couldn't say when she was standing in front of him. He wrote about how her kindness had taught him what love could actually look like. He wrote about watching her with her students and seeing the kind of person he wanted to become. He wrote about Lila's happiness in their small cottage and how, for the first time in years, they had felt like a real family. "If you believe that everything we shared was fake," he wrote, "then I'll leave tomorrow and never contact you again. But I'll make sure that your school's art program is funded forever, because the work you do with those children is more important than anything I've ever accomplished with my money." He left the letter on her porch that evening, then went home to pack their bags. If she didn't respond by morning, he would keep his promise and disappear from her life. That night was the longest of his life, filled with regret for all the ways his fear had hurt the person he loved most. The next morning, as Kane was loading suitcases into his car, he heard footsteps on the gravel path. He turned around and saw Amara walking toward him, his letter in her hand and tears in her eyes. "I fell in love with the man who burned toast making breakfast for his daughter," she said. "I fell in love with the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who paid for a heater when children were cold, who shared his umbrella even though we both got soaked anyway." She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see hope and love and forgiveness all mixed together in her expression. "I didn't fall in love with a billionaire. I fell in love with you, the real you, the one who was finally brave enough to be honest with me." Kane felt his heart restart as she reached for his hand. "Can we start over?" he asked. "This time with no secrets between us?" "I'd like that," she said. As they walked back toward the cottage together, with Lila skipping ahead and chattering excitedly about staying in their little town, Kane realized something wonderful. He no longer needed to hide behind masks or walls or fake identities. He had finally found someone who could see him clearly and love him anyway. And that was worth more than all the money in the world.